If you're done with graded readers but are completely lost when it comes to picking your first real Japanese book, or you're just looking for more book recommendations, then this video is for you. This year, I read 19 and 4/2 Japanese books, which is the most Japanese I've ever read in a year, ranging from really beginner-friendly books all the way to pretty difficult literary fiction. Some of these books I absolutely loved. Some of them, maybe not so much. But most of them taught me something about reading in Japanese. In this video, I'll break down the books by level and talk about what I liked and didn't like about each of them. So if you're looking for something to read after your graded readers, or you're looking for book recommendations beyond the 5 that are just floating around the learner community, let's get right into it. Okay, let's start with the first category. Books that are perfect for moving from graded readers to real Japanese books. They are relatively short, they're fun, easy, and really approachable, and are the perfect stepping stone for getting used to reading for longer times, keeping track of slightly more complex storylines and writing styles. First off, we have this collection of short stories which are kind of mythical and maybe a little scary, but in like a funny way. I think these are perfect if you don't quite yet feel ready to challenge longer stories or novels, and what I really loved about them is how creatively written they were and how much fun they were to read, which made the reading experience very enjoyable. I didn't love this book because it paints women in a rather strange light, but it is nevertheless a pretty humorous collection of short essays on everyday items that Japanese women might own. Each essay is like 7 to 8 pages long, which I think is a really good length, and I do think you get a pretty good insight into some of Japanese culture. Just take it with a grain of salt. I actually liked reading this book and thought it would be a lot of fun for someone just starting out. It is a murder mystery where a lot of the dialogue happens in a chat room, so that makes the style pretty unique and interesting. And even though I thought that the ending was a little over the top, I still think it is a well-written book. If you do decide to read this, do not get scared by the first introductory paragraph. It gets a lot easier after that. Next up, we have books for those of you who have maybe already read a few short stories and are now ready to move on into more serious literature without overwhelming yourself too much. Compared to the previous category, these books are a little more challenging in terms of vocabulary, length, and story structure, but they're still very accessible. They're great for building your reading confidence without getting completely lost in all the information. I couldn't not mention Frieren as the first book of this category, not because it is necessarily easier than the other ones, but because it is by far the best. If you liked Frieren, you watched the anime, you're a fan, this book is a must read. It follows 5 characters before the anime storyline and gives you a little more context on what happened and what kind of character they are. The vibe is literally exactly the same as the anime, and I loved it. The fact that it is split into 5 short stories about 5 different characters also makes it a little easier to read than like one long story. I read this book as part of a book club, and I gotta admit I didn't really enjoy it, mainly because the humor and the character interactions just weren't quite my style. That being said, I still think it is a pretty good first book to get started with. The premise is really interesting, there's a lot of dialogue, and the language use really isn't that difficult except for in a few scenes. So even if it may not be my style, not everyone's style, I still think it's worth giving it a try. This book is in a pretty weird spot because the language itself is pretty straightforward. Sentence by sentence, it's not that difficult to read. However, the premise of the story is that you are following the daily life of the woman with the purple skirt as another character in the story. And so the narrator doesn't have all the information and is not always reliable. So while the Japanese language is really not that difficult, the way the story is structured, I feel like could be a little confusing to learners. Finally, I present to you a lesbian short story collection with, I believe, 5 or 6 short stories about different types of homosexual relationships between working adult women. Some of these were okay. A lot of them felt a little rushed because I feel like there was too much put into too little space, and that made the stories felt kind of incomplete. But if you're looking for some adult life romance as opposed to, high school lovers, then maybe this is a good starting point for you. Next, we're moving into literature that is even more of a step up from the previous category, and this might be good for readers who maybe already read a book or two and are now ready to challenge themselves with more difficult vocabulary and grammar, but also with more complex storylines that might require you to actually catch the details. These books will be a little more tricky, but with time they will become accessible and you will be able to understand them fairly easily. They're a great way to improve your Japanese reading skills while just genuinely enjoying a good story. The Attack on Titan Lost Girl short stories are great if you're an Attack on Titan fan and want to expand your knowledge of the Attack on Titan world and the two main characters, Mikasa and Annie. Mikasa's story follows her through her early childhood and the story gets a little trippy. Annie's story is pretty technical and follows her as she prepares for a special mission. The author wrote these stories in a way that even if you don't catch all the details the first time around, they will be repeated throughout the story so that you can understand and follow the story even if you don't catch every single thing. Personally, I found that to be a little repetitive because they would just repeat the same information over and over, but I feel like it would be really helpful for someone who's just trying to enjoy the story and might not be able to follow every single detail. This horror/psycho thriller contains two short stories that are mysterious, suspenseful, and the endings are actually unexpected. The first story drags on a little too long in my opinion, and the vocabulary is a little difficult here and there, so it's not my number one recommendation. But if you're looking for something unusual to read, then this might be your book. This book is a wild ride, but despite its 32 on Learn Natively, I felt like it was not that difficult to read. The language is relatively straightforward. It's not like they use any crazy words or grammar, but I think what might make it more difficult to follow what's happening is that you're essentially in the head of a hikikomori. You're trying to follow the thought processes as he's going on wild tangents that have nothing to do with each other. The story is nevertheless pretty interesting, does require a few trigger warnings potentially though, but the vocabulary gets repeated, so there definitely is a learning effect throughout the book. I really wanted to like this book more than I actually did because I just felt like it opened up so many themes and storylines in the first half of the book that actually made it harder to read. Now, I really liked the story. It was about a tunnel that fulfills any wish you have in exchange for your youth, and I really liked how the author portrayed the different emotions between the different characters. So if you're in for a bit of a challenge on a variety of topics, then this might be a good pick. This book is a fantasy adventure book that is, I think, written for a bit of a younger audience, but the author did an amazing job at building the world and taking you along the story and really making you feel the magic. There are some scenes that will definitely require you to use a dictionary, but I think even if you can't appreciate all the details, the story is still super fun to read. I've been really enjoying books from this author. I feel like she explores so many facets of adult life, especially women's adult life, with a focus on relationships, both romantic and platonic, through just the lens of ordinary working women. I feel like these books helped me build my reading confidence so much while also learning about the culture and the role that women play and the experience that women have in Japan. Finally, we made it to the most challenging category. This category of books is for readers who are already pretty comfortable reading Japanese, because if you're not, you might get too caught up in the language to really understand all the underlying nuances and themes going on in the stories. These books are pretty tough, but they're really rewarding. They're a great way to keep pushing your Japanese while at the same time enjoying a good story and just discovering the country and the language and the culture through literature. I absolutely love this book. It is written by the same author as the previous two books and follows two women through decades of their lives. One being more career-oriented, while the other being more of a stay-at-home mom. And the author does such an amazing job of capturing so many emotions about love and friendship and hopes and dreams, and again, all told just through the everyday life and interactions of two very ordinary women. This is one of those books that really made me think and gave me a new perspective on life and what it means to be a woman. Definitely not super action-packed or dramatic, but just so deeply relatable. This is another 5 out of 5 book for me. I read it in like 4 days because the story was just that engaging. And usually I'm not too big of a fan of like stories set in high school because they feel a little immature, but the story is rather removed from high school. It is mysterious, it is adventurous, the dialogues are actually thoughtful, and while it does have a touch of romance to it, it doesn't take over the entire story. I had high hopes for this book, but it ended up being a little disappointing. It follows 3 women in their late 20s, early 30s as they navigate friendships and relationships, but I feel like the commentary on those topics was kept very superficial despite it being a pretty long book. What is really interesting though is that this author is from the Kansai region of Japan, and that is strongly reflected in the book as you get to learn a little bit about Kansai culture, and a lot of the characters actually speak in the Kansai dialect. So if you're looking for a book where you get to know a little more about Kansai as the area or the dialect, then this or other books by the same author might be a good read for you. Finally, to wrap things up, this was by far the hardest book I read this year. Hashire Merusu is the name of a short story, but also of the short story collection, which is what I read. And I found it really hard to read. I had to look up so many words. The stories didn't really have a common theme or anything either, so it was hard to follow what was happening at times. One of the short stories, for example, was just a stream of consciousness of some high school girl. Another story was, I think, a retelling from a scene in the Bible, but from a different perspective. Then there was a story about some Fujisan fanatic, and then some stories felt a little more autobiographical, I guess. So on top of using outdated and slightly more sophisticated Japanese, there was also no common theme, and it covered a lot of topics in these short stories. That said, the short story Hashire Merusu really isn't that difficult to read and is very commonly read in Japanese high school, so if you want the experience of reading a classic piece of literature, then definitely give it a try. The other short stories, however, I would not recommend unless you have already reached a really high level of literary proficiency. So that's all the books I read in 2025. I hope this mini review gave you some ideas or inspirations for books that you might want to try to tackle in the new year. If it did, please come back and let me know about your thoughts on the books as well. If you find that reading Japanese in general is a very daunting task, don't worry, I got you. I made a video on how to get started reading Japanese, so I recommend you check that out. Until then, see you in the next video.